When a spoiled rich girl mocked a well-dressed black man in a luxury hotel lobby, she thought she was putting him in his place. But when the hotel manager walked in and revealed who he really was, her smug smile disappeared. What followed was a powerful lesson she, and everyone watching, would never forget. Stay with us to see how one moment of arrogance turned into public humiliation. The Hôtel de Luxe in Paris glittered under the autumn sun, its marble facade reflecting the golden hues of the Champs-Élysées. Inside, the lobby buzzed with the quiet elegance of wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over velvet chairs, and the faint clink of champagne glasses mingled with hushed conversations. It was the kind of place where every detail screamed exclusivity, from the polished shoes of the bellhops to the tailored suits of the guests. Camille Laurent swept through the revolving doors, her designer heels clicking against the floor like a metronome. At 26, she was the heiress to a French cosmetics empire, her name synonymous with privilege. Her auburn hair was swept into a perfect chignon, and her emerald green coat screamed couture. But beneath the polish, Camille had a clumsiness, not just in her occasional stumbles, but in the way she wielded her entitlement like a blunt weapon. She was late for a meeting with her publicist, her phone pressed to her ear as she barked orders about a new ad campaign. That's when she collided with him. A tall, impeccably dressed black man in a charcoal suit that fit like it was made for him, which it probably was. His leather briefcase slipped from his hand, papers scattering across the marble floor. "Watch where you're going," Camille snapped, stumbling back. She caught herself on the edge of a table, her phone clattering to the ground. Her eyes narrowed as she sized him up. Smooth skin, sharp jawline, and a quiet confidence that didn't match the chaos she'd just caused. She didn't recognize him, and in her world, that meant he didn't belong. "Excuse me," he said calmly, kneeling to gather his papers. His voice was deep, measured, with a faint British accent that hinted at years spent abroad. Camille didn't hear the apology. She saw the staff milling around, bellhops in crisp uniforms, waiters balancing trays, and her mind leapt to the easiest conclusion. "You should be more careful," she said loudly, brushing off her coat as if he'd dirtied it. "What are you even doing in the lobby? Shouldn't you be, I don't know, polishing something?" A few heads turned. A woman in a fur stole paused mid-sip of her martini. A businessman glanced up from his newspaper. The man froze, his hand hovering over a blueprint stamped with intricate designs. He looked up at her, his dark eyes steady. But Camille was already on a roll. "I mean, honestly," she continued, her voice rising with theatrical flair, "if you're going to work here, at least know your place. This isn't the service entrance." She laughed, a sharp, cutting sound, and waved a hand dismissively. "Someone get this guy a mop or something." The lobby grew quieter, the air thickening with tension. A teenage girl near the concierge desk pulled out her phone, the faint click of her camera app punctuating the silence. Another guest, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, started recording too, his lens trained on Camille's smug grin. The man stood slowly, brushing off his knees. At 6'3", he towered over her, but his expression remained unreadable. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone still polite, though there was an edge to it now, like a blade sheathed in velvet. Camille scoffed, crossing her arms. "Oh, please, don't act like you're some VIP. I know everyone who matters here." She turned to the growing crowd, playing to her audience. "Can you believe this guy? Thinking he can just waltz in like he owns the place?" Before he could respond, the double doors behind the reception desk swung open, and out strode Julien Moreau, the hotel's general manager. His suit was pristine, his silver hair slicked back, and his face lit up with recognition, not for Camille, but for the man she'd just humiliated. "Mr. Adeyemi!" Julian exclaimed, his voice warm and deferential. He crossed the lobby in quick strides, extending a hand. "We've been expecting you. It's an honor to have you with us." Camille blinked, her smirk faltering. The man, Mr. Adeyemi, shook Julian's hand, offering a small, gracious smile. "Thank you, Julian. I was just getting acquainted with the ambiance." Julian chuckled, then glanced at the scattered papers. "Oh, let me get someone to help with that." He snapped his fingers, and a bellhop rushed over, but his eyes flicked toward Camille, narrowing slightly. "Is everything all right here?" The crowd was fully invested now, phones still rolling. Camille's face flushed, but she doubled down, tossing her hair. "Wait, you know this guy? What's he, some kind of VIP janitor?" Julian's smile tightened. "Madam," he said, his tone icing over, "this is Daniel Adeyemi, the world-renowned architect and our keynote speaker for the International Design Summit tomorrow. He's not only a guest, he's the reason half the VIPs in this hotel are here." The words hit like a slap. Camille's mouth opened, then closed, her arrogance crumbling in real time. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, his gaze sliding to her with a mix of pity and indifference. "It's an easy mistake," he said quietly. "Happens more often than you'd think." The lobby of the Hotel Deluxe seemed to shrink around Camille as Julianne's words hung in the air. Daniel Adeyemi, an architect, a celebrity in his field, stood there, unruffled, while her bravado dissolved like sugar in the rain. The teenage girl with the phone giggled behind her hand, and the man with the gray beard muttered something to his companion, who nodded vigorously. The footage was already live, no doubt pinging across X and Instagram with hashtags like #ParisKaren and #CheckYourPrivilege. Camille's throat tightened. She wasn't used to being the one on display, not like this. I didn't mean," she stammered, but Julianne cut her off with a raised hand. "Madam, I suggest you lower your voice," he said, his politeness now a thin veneer over steel. "Mr. Adeyemi is a valued guest, and we don't tolerate this kind of behavior here." He gestured to a security guard who'd materialized near the concierge desk, a burly man with a headset and a no-nonsense stare. Daniel raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. "It's fine, Julianne. I'd rather not make a scene." He glanced at Camille, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something. Amusement? Disdain? Before he turned back to the manager. "I'll head to my suite now. I've got work to finish before tomorrow." Julianne nodded, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. "Of course. Your team's already upstairs, and we've set up the conference suite for your presentation. Let me know if you need anything." He shot Camille a final, withering look before escorting Daniel toward the elevators, leaving her stranded in the middle of the lobby. The crowd didn't disperse. If anything, it thickened. Guests whispering, staff exchanging glances, phones still pointed her way. Camille's face burned as she snatched her phone from the floor, her fingers trembling. She needed to get out, to call her publicist and spin this before it spiraled further. But as she turned toward the exit, the security guard stepped into her path. "Miss Laurent," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "I'm afraid I'll need to escort you out. Hotel policy." "What?" she snapped, incredulous. "Do you know who I am? My family practically owns half the businesses on this street." "I'm aware," the guard replied, unfazed. "But this isn't about your family. It's about your conduct. Let's go." Before she could argue, he took her arm, not roughly, but with enough authority to make resistance pointless. The walk to the door felt endless, every step a spotlight on her humiliation. Outside, the crisp Paris air hit her like a slap, and the guard released her with a curt nod before retreating back inside. Camille stood on the sidewalk, her breath fogging in the chill. She opened her phone, fingers hovering over her publicist's number, when a notification pinged. Then another, and another. Her mentions on X were exploding, clips of the incident already racking up thousands of views. "Rich girl gets owned," one caption read. "Racist heiress humiliated by architect king," said another. A grainy still of her sneering face was plastered everywhere, juxtaposed with a photo of Daniel Adeyemi accepting an award at some glitzy gala. She wanted to scream, to blame someone, anyone, but the truth gnawed at her. She'd misjudged him, and not just his status. She'd seen his skin, his quiet demeanor, and built a story that fit her narrow world. Now that world was cracking. Meanwhile, upstairs in the penthouse suite, Daniel sat at a glass table, blueprints spread before him. His team, 3 assistants and a fellow architect, chattered about the summit, but his mind drifted. He'd faced scenes like this before, in London, New York, Dubai. The assumptions, the microaggressions, the way people's eyes skimmed over his accolades and landed on his race. He'd learned to let it roll off him, to channel it into his work. Cathedrals that defied gravity, skyscrapers that kissed the clouds. But today stung more than usual, maybe because of the crowd, maybe because of her sheer audacity. His assistant, Priya, slid a tablet across the table. "Boss, you're trending. Want me to draft a statement?" Daniel shook his head, rubbing his temple. "No, let it play out. People will see what they want to see." Back on the street, Camille paced, her coat flapping in the wind. She could call her driver, retreat to her apartment, and wait for this to blow over. But something stopped her. A prick of shame, faint but growing. She'd been wrong. Horribly, publicly wrong. And for once, money couldn't erase it. The Paris sky had darkened by the time Camille stopped pacing outside the Hotel de Luxe. Streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows over the cobblestones, and the hum of evening traffic drowned out the chatter of her phone, still buzzing with notifications. She silenced it, shoving it into her coat pocket. Her driver was 5 minutes away, but she didn't want to go home. Not yet. The idea of facing her pristine apartment, with its marble counters and empty silence, felt suffocating. She started walking, her heels unsteady on the uneven pavement. The Champs-Élysées glittered around her, boutiques with their haughty mannequins, cafes spilling laughter into the night. But she felt detached, like a ghost drifting through someone else's life. Her mind replayed the lobby scene on a loop, her shrill voice, Daniel Adeyemi's calm rebuttal, the manager's icy stare. She'd always prided herself on her instincts, her ability to read a room. How had she gotten it so wrong? A block away, she ducked into a small café, its windows steamed from the warmth inside. The barista, a young woman with a nose ring, barely glanced at her as she ordered a black coffee. Camille slid into a corner booth, the vinyl seat creaking under her weight. She stared at the cup, its surface rippling slightly from her shaky hands, and let the noise of the place wash over her. Clinking spoons, murmured French, a baby's laugh from the next table. Her phone buzzed again. Against her better judgment, she pulled it out. The video had hit 1 million views. Comments ranged from scathing, entitled "Brat needs a reality check," to gleeful, "Architect dude is a legend." A few defended her, claiming it was an honest mistake, but they were drowned out by the outrage. Someone had dug up her family's history, her father's cosmetics empire, her mother's charity galas, and tied it to old rumors of discriminatory hiring practices. True or not, it was ammunition. Camille's chest tightened. She wasn't a monster. She'd grown up in a bubble, yes. Private schools, yacht summers, a world where everyone looked and sounded like her. But she'd never thought of herself as that person. Racist. The word felt like a brand, searing deeper the longer she sat with it. Across town, in the hotel's conference suite, Daniel Adeyemi leaned back in his chair, the summit prep winding down. His team had left, and the room was quiet save for the hum of the projector. He scrolled through X on his laptop. The same clips Camille was agonizing over playing silently on the screen. He'd avoided the spotlight after incidents like this before, but this time felt different. The world was watching, and not just him, her too. He remembered her face in that final moment, the flicker of shock before the guard led her out. She wasn't the first to misjudge him, and she wouldn't be the last. Part of him wanted to let it go, to focus on his keynote tomorrow, a speech about designing spaces that bridge divides, ironically enough. But another part wondered if she'd learn anything from this, or if she'd just retreat into her gilded cage. Back at the café, Camille's coffee had gone cold. She was about to leave when the door chimed, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Tall, charcoal suit, briefcase in hand. Daniel Adeyemi. Her stomach dropped. He hadn't seen her yet. His attention on the barista as he ordered an espresso. She could slip out, avoid the confrontation. But something, guilt, curiosity, desperation, pinned her to the seat. He turned, scanning the room, and their eyes met. For a second, neither moved. Then he walked over, his steps deliberate, and stopped at her table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his tone neutral. She nodded mutely, her mouth dry. He set his espresso down and slid into the booth, his presence filling the space without effort. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, sipping his drink. "Thought you'd be halfway to a chateau by now." I'm sorry," she blurted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "For earlier. I was awful. I didn't know who you were, and It's not about who I am," he cut in, his voice steady but sharp. "It's about what you assumed. You didn't see a person. You saw a stereotype. That's the problem." She flinched, but he wasn't wrong. "I don't know how to fix it," she admitted, her voice small. "Everyone hates me now. They're right to." Daniel studied her, his gaze softening just a fraction. "They don't hate you. They hate what you did. There's a difference. What you do next matters more than what's trending tonight." The cafe hummed around them, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Camille swallowed, her mind racing. He didn't owe her this grace, this chance to explain herself. Yet here he was, not absolving her, but not condemning her either. "I want to make it right," she said finally. "I don't know how, but I do." He leaned back, finishing his espresso. "That's a start. Figure it out. I've got a speech to give tomorrow. Maybe you'll hear something useful." He stood, leaving a few euros on the table, and walked out into the night. Camille sat there, the cafe's warmth seeping into her bones. The road ahead wasn't clear. Apologies wouldn't erase the video, and redemption wasn't guaranteed. But for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of possibility. Maybe she'd show up to that summit. Maybe he'd see her in the crowd. Maybe Paris, with all its beauty and flaws, still had lessons to teach them both.